Good afternoon, everyone. For the April 2nd meeting of the Charter Review Commission, we have Judge Adrian, Diane Downing, the Honorable Drucker.
Here.
Dennis Kennedy.
Here.
Michael King. The Honorable Persiak, he's not here. Claire Rizzaco. Victor Ruiz. And Davita Russell, who isn't here.
Much to my chagrin and dismay. This is a call meeting between our ordinary sessions for the specific purpose of dealing with two matters. One is to take up the proposal that had been put before us at the last meeting as it related to the recommendations coming from the Human Resources Department and the Personnel Review Commission, who had spent some time and effort to overcome some issues that they had been having, and it come up with a joint proposal. We were taking the time in between the last meeting and this meeting to review what they had given us, and so that we could decide whether or not we wanted to adopt the proposals that they had put forward as recommendations coming from the commission and going to the council. So I want to open the floor then for questions or comments or suggestions as it relates to any changes that any of the members of the commission have seen as either problematic or necessary for us to take up before we deal with this. Okay. If there are none, then I'm going to entertain a motion.
I would so move that we accept the changes as presented.
Very well. Is there a second? It's properly moved and seconded that we adopt the changes that have been proposed as presented. Is there any unreadiness on the motion? Any unreadiness on the motion? Any unreadiness on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Very well. It will be adopted. The second item of business is a little bit more complex. Deals with the review of proposal that was presented by Councilman Dale Miller as it related to the issues of succession, both for county council and for the county executive. Those matters were put forth in a fairly detailed presentation by Councilman Miller a couple of meetings ago. We asked him to come back at the last meeting and to expand on what he had presented, and at the conclusion of that presentation, we took it under advisement with the idea that we would take it up today to see if we were either in agreement or if we had some suggestions for modifications and or change in the language. In the interim period, I asked staff to present the document you have in front of you that's entitled County Executive Succession Amendments, and it has both the proposed amendments and the current language, so we could kind of compare and contrast. And then this is a work session today to go over the materials that are presented. And this may take, yet and still another session after today, because I know you haven't had a lot of time to read this over. So can we just take just a few minutes just to kind of briefly go over what you have in front of you, and then we can decide on a course of action.
Judge?
Yes.
I would also like to say real quick that you all have the presentation, but there's an additional document that has the exact language for the charter. In the presentation, it kind of gives like an overview, but we have the exact language in the additional document that you have.
Thank you. The one thing I think I forgot to ask you to do for me, Janae, was I know that at the conclusion of the last session that the county executive had indicated that he had a number of considerations that he thought needed to be before us, before we passed on this. And I didn't know how much of that you captured, of his remarks, or whether or not they're recorded. But we probably would do well to have that in front of us, too. Okay.
It was recorded. We actually have the minutes that we will present at the next meeting, so she can go grab that now for you guys just to have that to look over, just to be able to reference.
Okay.
So she's going to go make copies real quick.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Are we set? Okay. Questions? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So I guess in the first proposal for the current language or section 2.04, I do like the idea that we discussed. I remember at the last meeting, I did make a comment about, I had hesitations about just appointing the law director, but I do believe it is important to have someone immediately lined up. And then I think it was Michael who suggested have the law director and then have something already set in place to a process of how you're going to appoint someone. I still am a little hesitant then with the 14 days, maybe if we could increase that to 30, just because by the time you get people, you're talking to people about an appointment. This isn't a position that people would decide overnight. Yeah, okay, I'll be the interim appointment. So I would just like to see that 14 days maybe moved up to 30. And then the only other thing is I still would like to see removed, but not shall be a candidate in the election. I think that's up to so if we add maybe up to 30 days and then remove that, I like that proposal. But I don't like tying someone's hands that they can't run if they chose to. And a lot of times you'll find with an interim that some people will choose to say, I'll do the interim position, but I don't want to run for election. But let that be the individual's decision. Because I believe it was Dennis that made the comment, you might appoint someone and they're doing a great job, and then you're saying, oh, but you can't run. So, so those are my comments on this first page. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I think I agree with both of those comments. I think one of the things that we should still be thinking about is what if there is some type of, stalemate or hung council that can't decide on an interim at some point. And in that instance, I mean, one thing you could do, I think, is have the law director continue to serve. And so you could put in language that says the law director becomes acting immediately upon the vacancy, and then council may appoint within 30 days an interim to replace the law director that may be, more appropriate depending on the circumstances. But that if they're unable to make that appointment, that the law director continue to serve until the special election or what other event that we decide is appropriate to ultimately reach a successor. I don't know what the commission thinks about that, but.
Well, the one thing, I noticed in most city charters is that council has so many days, 30 days, 45 days. If they don't make an appointment within those 30 or 45 days, for example, for a council member, if you don't reappoint within 45 days, then it automatically becomes the mayor's choice. So maybe in this case, if council didn't agree, then maybe I don't know with the law director, but possibly the law director gets the appointment, because then you're telling council, listen, if you want to make this appointment, then you have to, everyone's got to come to the table. So you don't have a stalemate. So I don't know who that person would be, because especially with the executive's position. If it was a council position, you could say then the county executive could appoint then. But I don't know who that best choice would be for the county executive position. But that's another option. But I see what you mean, because if you get a stalemate, then you're stuck.
Right. And I think if you look at what the current language says for council vacancies, how it works is if there's a council vacancy, then the precinct committee members of the same political party have 30 days to appoint. If they don't, then council has 30 days to appoint. And if they don't, then the county executive gets to appoint. So there you have that cascading process. So we can think about all different types of appointing authorities, but I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, though, the difference with that, though, is that all of those entities that you named are in some way elected. And what my concern is about the law director having, ongoing authority or power is that he wasn't elected at all in any capacity. And I think, going to the administrative for that, it just takes it too far away from the people, from the electorate. So that's the concern I have with that.
I can understand that concern, but I guess the pushback from that is that if you don't do that, first of all, there is a necessity for us to have continuity. So if somebody leaves that office, you want to have somebody fill in the office as quickly as possible. I think that by setting up in such a way so that the law director takes it immediately, but giving council the ability to, fill the vacancy, and council knowing that if they don't fill a vacancy, that it's going to end up being that person, that it puts the weight kind of on council, who are the people's elected representatives, to fill it. And what would be your alternative, I guess? What would you think? What would you like to see?
I just don't see extending the law directors. So I don't really have a response to your question, but I don't see extending the law director's authority or tenure. So.
I agree with Diane. I wasn't sure why the law director was selected to begin with. I know it was a suggestion, not understanding really the role that person plays. When I look at the function of county and, how, from an administrative perspective, how it administers a lot of funds and the social programs it provides to the county, along with other things. I'm just wondering if there's another role within the organization that has a more day-to-day understanding of that work that could be a better fit than the law director. But again, I don't fully understand everything that the law director does.
But what we do understand is that the law director is not elected. Okay, so of all of the elected, personnel, and I guess that was the reason why the language was to have the president of council, move into that spot. But I really think that just kind of knocks things into a cocked hat, because it really kind of knocks that person out. And then what do we do with them? If we take them and we put them in on an interim basis, or we put them in, if it is an interim basis, say for instance, if you got an executive who has to step away because of some kind of medical issue, under the current language, I think if the council president steps in, that becomes a vacancy. And if we're not trying to create a vacancy there, then I guess you can have somebody in council be the interim council president. I mean, is that the way we would go forward?
Well, to that point, Mr. Chair, I mean, there is a council vice president already, so that vice president could assume the roles of the council president. And I know we discussed Summit County has a provision, and I believe a number of municipalities have provisions where the council president can retain his or her seat, or at least return to his or her seat on council. So I think you could potentially come up with a scenario where the council president would assume the duties of the county executive on an interim basis until it's filled, whether by special election or the subsequent election, however we decide we want to go. And then assuming their council term hasn't expired, then they could return to their role on council.
Okay, and during that interim period of time, would we be looking at council being one short?
I would assume so, because you wouldn't be filling it because it wouldn't be vacant.
Right.
So.
Mr. Chair, so in looking at both proposals, I almost feel like that's the hybrid of the two that makes more sense to me. I like them both in some ways, but I feel like the proposal is a little bit complicated and maybe too complicated. Plus, doesn't have an elected official stepping in. But if you could have your council president step in for a period of time that's defined before your election, that, and not fill his vacancy, because I agree, I don't think it's fair he steps in and then he or she, and then they're out, just because of a situation they could not control. But it makes sense, I think, to have the council president step in for a defined period of time before that special election, not lose their seat, but have the special election a little sooner maybe than what we're even in charter at the moment. As they said, first year, second year, then you have your election. But if you're close to the third or fourth year, you stay in. That gets a little dicey too. What if we could define it a little more and say, the council president becomes the executive, but with a defined period of time before that next special election? Maybe it's 90 days. I mean, I don't know. But something that is easy to understand, we know the process, and it's very defined, so that you always have an elected official in that post. And I know it might be, the issue I'd have in my back of my mind is costly, but I feel like, you also have to do the right thing, and for the county, for the citizens. Just a thought. It's kind of a hybrid of the two, but a little simpler than what maybe is being proposed.
Yeah, I know that the county exec had expressed some concern about having an election within 90 to 180 days, saying that wasn't enough time to, for people to raise the money and do what they needed to do
That's a good point, too.
to run for an office of this magnitude. It seems to me that certainly 180 days would be enough time. I think about the way that they do parliamentary elections, and that may not be the best thing of all worlds, but sometimes it seems like it's a whole lot better than the way that we do elections here. 6 months to raise the money and to,
Mr. Chair, in terms of the cost, I mean, I think if you set a 180-day time frame, you're almost always going to have either a primary election, a general election, or some other date designated for special elections within that time frame. I think currently how the primaries work are, the primary, at least this year, is in May. The filing deadline, assuming we're doing a single open election, the filing deadline is 90 days before that. And normally you want to build in about a 30-day buffer even before that, so people have enough notice to know that they have to file by the filing deadline. So I would say probably somewhere between 120 and 180 days would be an appropriate time frame in which to have an election. But we can get more into that when we want to talk about special elections in a little more detail. But
Yes.
Just to, I think one of the points the executive made last week, the current language in the charter that speaks to vacancies is pretty much a permanent vacancy, meaning someone has departed, but I think you brought up a good point. I mean, what if there's an interim vacancy, if there's a health issue or some other obligation that would cause that person not to totally step aside from the office, but what do we do then for a non-permanent vacancy? How are we going to address that? I'm not sure that there's any provision right now to deal with that.
Yeah, and then when and how do you declare a vacancy? I think is an important piece too, because if you are going to say that an individual who, say for instance, has a medical emergency that makes it not possible for them to function, has not vacated the seat, who decides at what point that somebody needs to step in on an interim basis? And then if that happens, how much of the rest of this needs to be triggered? Because you wouldn't want to have to go through a special election and all those kind of things if the person is going to come back. So I think that those are considerations that we need to take in also. But I agree with you also about the fact that I believe that if we put somebody in office, we shouldn't automatically disqualify them from running.
Right.
That's up to that individual, and then it's up to the people.
Right. Exactly.
Especially in these days, because it seems to me that the aura of incumbency has kind of lost its glow. A lot of people are looking at the incumbents with a jaundiced eye anymore. So it might not be the kind of thing that it was in the past. So I guess the question at this point, as far as process is concerned, is how do you want to deal with this? Do you want to deal with each one of these things, with the suggestions that, do we want to pass on some of these suggestions today? And then whatever we end up with, that'll be today's work. And then if we have to come back and we have to look at the other sections, we deal with them. Is that, because it seems to me that there's no way that we're going to get through this whole document today. And we're going to have to do some additional work. So if that's agreeable, can we drill down into 2.04 and see what we think is most acceptable by way of recommendations? Because after all, at the end of the day, when we get through all of this, it's just a recommendation to the council.
Right.
Okay. All right. So first parts of the language, that is, in the event that the office of the county executive becomes vacant by reason of death, removal from office, failure to remain an elector of the county, or for any other reason. Okay.
I would say, should say permanently vacant.
Well, that's, I was going to ask if we're going to talk about a temporary vacancy and permanent, maybe this one should just be about a permanent vacancy.
Okay.
We can add permanent, I think we should add permanent there.
And then perhaps what we're looking at is adding an additional clause or an additional section that deals with temporary vacancies.
Right.
Okay. So we'd be talking about just in the event that the office of the county executive becomes permanently vacant. Right. Okay, so that's the first clause. Then, if I understood you correctly, we're really suggesting that the council president step in rather than the law director, right? On an interim basis. Do we want that to happen until an interim appointment is made, or do we want it until there's an election?
Till an interim appointment is made.
Okay. Okay. So that would be the second clause, second sentence of this. And the third is, I think we were in agreement that 14 days was too short.
Right.
Is 30 days sufficient, or do we need more time than that?
30 is good.
Because you want council to get to the table and make this point.
Right.
14 days, depending on the timing of the year. If it's at the holidays, or if it's at the holidays, or maybe in a summer where council's recessed for a meeting or two, it could put some challenges to getting a quorum together to do that.
But 30 days is sufficient?
Yeah.
Don't need more than that? Just, okay. Everybody agreement?
I think 30 days is a reasonable timeline. I mean, it's, I think, an important enough position to be filled that you don't want to wait much longer than that.
Okay. Within 30 days after the vacancy occurs, the county council shall make an interim appointment to the office of county executive. That's the third sentence. The interim appointee shall have been an elector of the county throughout the 2 years prior to the appointment and shall serve until a successor is elected and takes office.
And then end the sentence there.
And end the sentence there. Okay. Everybody okay with this?
Mr. Chair, just one thought, and I know we had talked about having an interim appointed, and I know, Diane, you were looking for that. I'm wondering if we, and maybe this is contingent upon the time frame in which we look at a special election, but if currently what the language says is the council president serves until the next countywide general election, at which point an executive is elected through the end. If we're going to have a special election within 180 days, I'm wondering, since the council has already basically elected the council president, if they do that every 2 years currently, if they do that with the which they currently do, I believe, they vote for the council president, keeping in mind that that person could succeed to the office of county executive, whether or not we need an interim between the council president and whenever a special election is held. I don't really feel strongly about this. I'm just sort of throwing it out there. And I think it's one of the concerns that the executive had about potentially having 4 different county executives over a very short period of time.
So if I understand you correctly, and it's a real possibility that I do not, okay, what you're saying is you could have the council president appointed as the interim and serve until an election?
I guess it wouldn't, the council president wouldn't even necessarily be appointed. It would, as currently, he would automatically succeed and then would serve until the special election, at which point he or she could return to their seat on council. And I think that's potentially
what I was getting at too. Yeah, it's just simple, and as long as we define that time frame, like you said, 180 days, whatever, that makes sense to me. Then it's, again, simple, know the succession, keep that council president seat available, but then we're done. You know, we go boom and boom.
Diane? issues?
No, I like the simplicity of it,
Me too.
so.
Dennis?
Does the 180 days start from the date of the vacancy or from the 30-day provision, the window that the first appointee will be serving in?
Under the current language or under the
What
concept?
proposed, yeah,
So-
conception.
I guess in the concept I proposed, there wouldn't be that 30 days. It would just be the council president
for
would
the
be
full one.
the executive, and then,
Succession
Yeah.
instead of appointment.
right,
Correct.
Whole appointment.
You got it.
right.
Okay.
Which is
And that
the
would
way
be
it is
immediate.
now.
Right,
so.
right. And the difference is, that's what I like about the process. It simplifies it. It is similar to what it is now, but instead of getting into the first year, second year, third year, 4-year issue, and then the council president not being able to go back to their seat, which to me doesn't make sense. You know, you're defining it, 180 days makes sense. They know that's going to occur. They'll be back in their seat after that 180 days, the council person, president, and you have a new county executive. It's just simple.
Unless he or she runs
For county, yeah,
executive.
Right, but then they
That's
know,
true.
but then that automatically would open their seat for
Right.
someone to run for that. So you'd actually could
That would-
potentially have two
exactly.
elections, so you know that
Oh,
at that
that's true,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So that would be,
Right.
that, then you know it really,
What's
so you
happening,
might have
yeah.
a
What
seat
is
vacant,
you're
but
right.
it's a limited time and it's a council seat. And
Correct.
the person's still gonna take care of their ward too, or their district, so.
Yeah, I would think. Okay, so that eliminates the 30-day window,
Right.
right? And automatic succession. And then 180 days from the person taking the seat, we'd be talking about an election.
Right.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. And one of the things we can talk, I think 180 days is around the right time frame. I know Brendan Doyle's in the room, who is works with the prosecutor's office. He's legal counsel to the Board of Elections, and I think it might be helpful if before we pin down particular dates or number of days, we might want to get a better idea about their timeline, because I know what I sort of looked up this afternoon, but I don't. I think it might be helpful to understand the state timeframes for how they schedule elections to pin that down. But we can.
I agree with that, because I'm always concerned about the expense of a special election, and also historically it's low turnout. Now, sometimes that works to an issue or candidate's advantage, but I'm just saying it has been always that way, or I think it has always been that way.
Yeah, and low turnout elections just aren't representative.
Right.
You know, as far as I'm concerned. Brendan, anything you want to add?
I think the staff at the Board of Elections would appreciate being consulted about some of those timelines. They've tried to make sort of a concerted effort to work with some of the charter municipalities as they work through their charter review commissions to decide what those timelines should be. So I think the staff would appreciate working with all of you, whoever is appropriate, to work on what those timelines should be.
Okay. It seems to me that what Michael was saying a little bit earlier is probably fairly accurate, that within 180 days almost of anything, that there's going to be a special election or something that falls in. But, it's also possible that somebody could vacate a seat maybe about a month before a primary election, for instance, and you might not, 6 months down the line might not be far enough for you to get to the general election, and then we got another problem. So, language-wise and, semantics matter. It would be good for us to try to figure out, how to do that so that most of the time this would fall within the realm of something that's already scheduled. Because, having had the responsibility of looking over the way that the Board of Elections has to do its duty, special elections are a pain. And that's putting it lightly, and an expensive pain at that. So whatever we get by way of a proposal here, we can send it over to you guys and let you vet it, raise any issues that you have with the language that we end up with, and then maybe make some suggestions that may give us some elasticity, you know, so that, you know, within 180 days or not more than 180 days, or 180, not more than 240, whatever it is, in order to make sure that it makes it to the next election cycle. Rather than, you know, because I'd like to avoid a special election at all costs, as long as it doesn't really do damage to, you know, the office.
Right.
Board staff would appreciate that. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. Well, as Captain Picard would say, make it so. Okay. All righty. So as far as the county exec is concerned, you think we pin this down? Good enough, Kim?
Yes.
Well, I just have one clarifying question on that. Sorry, I keep extending these discussions. I just want to make sure, is it our intent that this be an open election, nonpartisan, or are we leaving open the possibility for a partisan primary and special election following that?
You know, if it was up to me, it would be a dead run for election, okay? Because I think, you know, if you start putting in partisan primaries, especially in this county, I think it's just a waste.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a waste.
Okay.
I don't know how anybody else feels.
Does that conflict with, I know we talked that partisan idea, we voted to not even discuss it, so that's an interesting point you bring up, because I mean, aren't they're partisan elections throughout the whole county, right?
Mm-hmm.
For those, so you're saying no, if it's a special election, but only if it's special, but if it fell on a primary or a general, then it is partisan? Is that what you're saying?
There's a good question.
I mean, because then it's conflicting with the other part of the charter that we said we weren't going to discuss. So I think we need to be careful that we don't create something in one section that conflicts with.
It's called the law of unintended consequences.
Michael brought it up. It's his fault.
Well, I think it's interesting because if we decide to make it nonpartisan, which I think is a reasonable decision, you could have a situation where you would have candidates who could win in a nonpartisan election who maybe wouldn't win in a partisan election. And so it would be different from the normal election calendar and election schedule. I don't know if that's necessarily a good or bad thing, but it's just something to think about, I guess.
Well, the thing that strikes me even more than that is what Diane just raised a second ago is what happens if you have, you set an election for this office and you set it at a time that's the same as a partisan primary or partisan primaries, okay, except for the fact that now you've got this hybrid that's sitting out here that's not partisan.
Yeah.
You know, how's that going to sit with the partisans? You know, I don't know how that works.
Maybe that's something else we refer with the Board of Elections, see what their recommendation would be.
I think so.
I just think we need to be careful we don't create conflict within the charter.
Yeah.
I still think, though, the 180 days would allow for a process, a partisan process, as we have now. So I see the point. I appreciate the point. I just think it could be taken care of in that period of time.
But what I guess I'm concerned about at the moment is our recommendation. You know,
Right.
What are we recommending? So if we're recommending that we follow the guidance that we've just come up, are we also at the same time going to recommend that that 180 days include a partisan process before the 180 days expires? That, as they say, is the rub.
Yeah, and I think the concepts we've discussed so far are you could have a traditional partisan process where you have a primary election and then the winners of those partisan primaries go on to the general. or you could have a nonpartisan process where everybody just has their name on the ballot totally open, or you could, I guess, have a hybrid, as I think was recommended by at least one person initially, where you have an open election where people can identify themselves as partisans, but you wouldn't necessarily limit one candidate per party in that instance. You could have, 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans or something.
Are those other amendments, though? Conflicting? Would those require other amendments to the charter?
I don't believe so if we only limited it to the special elections. But if we decided we wanted the special elections and the regular elections to be consistent, then yeah, that would require changes to other sections of the charter.
And again, since all we're doing is recommending things to the council, I don't want to send anything to the council that's going to be dead on arrival, and I think that the more we tinker, the more likely it is that, a recommendation is not going to get the necessary votes to actually be put before the public. So, to me, and it's, this is just one man's opinion, I could be wrong, but, to me, the most elegant way to proceed would just be to let it be a straight run for election. People can designate whether they're Republicans or Democrats, for purposes of their advertising and all that kind of stuff, and you just let the people sort it out. And even though other offices that traditionally would have partisan primaries beforehand would continue to have that, this would just be because of the fact that there was a special circumstance that brought about the vacancy in the first place, a special way for us to deal with it. It just seems like that would be the cleanest way to deal with it. And again, the council could disagree with us entirely. So, I'm just trying to figure out, what's going to be the most likely to garner the number of votes to get passage.
So if we do party designation, but it doesn't limit the number of candidates, would that be in conflict with the other section?
Again, I think it would be, I don't think it would be, as long as we specified that it only applied to the special election. And then for regular elections, you'd still have the primary.
Right, you'd have to go through your primary, okay.
General, yeah.
Right.
Well, that takes care of it. It's kind of like that hybrid you were talking about. Sure, go right ahead.
I would just, for everybody to consider, if we just have like an unlimited field, is there any thought that, traditionally Cuyahoga County, we could have like 6 people with the same name running for it and 6 other people with the same name running for it? I mean, I don't know if we're complicating it for the electorate or not, if we don't cap the number of people that can get, I don't know how you do that, but I'm just, I'm not going to use any names, but, if we all know.
You know how many Dennis Kennedys there are out there?
So that would just be, I think we might be shooting ourselves in the foot if we end up with a ballot where there's 3 or 4 names, but there's 6 people who hold that last name running. I mean, if we're not going to somehow pare down the field, it may make it overly complicated. I don't know. That's something I think we should think about.
Well, I think also, as we talk about what's going to be dead on arrival or what would garner the county council's favor, I mean, I don't know how they would respond to an open, everybody gets their name on the ballot. That's why I was thinking if it could fit within a time frame, although I'm not knowing how that could work, but if the process could be the same partisan process that we've had, although abbreviated, and that's where I'd be interested in the Board of Elections working or looking at calendars, because I don't know if county council would see it as the solution to have the ability to just, and everyone who gets petitions signed be able to be on that ballot.
Yeah, it seems to me that no matter which way we go, there's the possibility that
That's
somebody's
true.
going to look at it funny. And I'm thinking about situations, obviously, nobody knows when a vacancy of this sort is going to arise. So, I mean, you could have a situation where somebody left office, say, 4 months before a general election. Okay. So if you applied the 6 months as a maximum period, that would mean that they'd miss that window, and then we're into a spot where you'd have to have a special election, okay? Or if it was like the month before. No matter how you do this, the question is, is the timing ever going to work out where it would be just right? And how do we do that? So, seemed like a good idea at the time.
And maybe that's why the current language is vague. In the first or second year, or in the third or fourth year.
Yeah, I'm sure there were some long debates given the nature of how complicated that language is. Well, I thought we had a solution. Now I'm not so sure. So, what? Never mind. I thought it through, and that was wrong.
So, Mr. Chair, if you refer it back to the Board of Elections based on the calendar, I think we have an election roughly every 6 months, typically, coming up. In this case, it's May and November. Some cases, it might be March and November. So if you did do your regular partisan elections, you're still within about 6 months of being able to do that. You just may be in a May, cycle versus your general in November. You know what I mean? So every 6 months we have something coming up on the ballot. So if the Board of Elections could look at that and tell us what's like, what are some of the scenarios to happen? Within 6 months, you're going to have an election that's countywide. If you go partisan, then that whatever cycle you're in, that's your primary, and then 6 months you could do your general. It just means that your council president is going to serve potentially a longer period of time if you want to keep it on your partisan cycle.
But then you're out of the 180.
Yeah, you're definitely
days.
out of the 180
So,
potentially. That's exactly
That's the
right.
problem.
You're right. You might have to go longer.
Well, the question, I guess, might be how far outside of the 180 days? Because depending on, how much more than 180 days, again, as looking at what was the concern expressed earlier, you'd still have somebody who was elected by the people serving in that position until such time as you got somebody else that was elected specifically for the position.
That's true.
Yeah.
So, the fact that it went longer than 180 days might not be as much of a problem. Especially if what we're talking about is trying to set it up in such a way so that you would still be able to have, partisan primaries, have enough time for people to put their candidacies together and their campaigns together so that people would know who they are and what they're doing, during that time frame, and then to have the main candidates be able to run for the general election for that office. The fact that it was more than 180 days, I think is, as long as you've got an elected official sitting in the spot in the interim period, not as much of a problem. The question would be, how do we set it up semantically so that, it works?
Yeah, I think conceptually it makes sense to have maybe 180 days is the target time frame in which to have an election, but you may want to give that wiggle room based on the election calendar or when the vacancy occurs to say, 120 to 200 days or something like that. But that's where I think it would be very helpful to have some feedback from the Board of Elections to say, here's what maybe some other jurisdictions do, and now it seems to be working. So.
Okay. is everybody satisfied with that? We'll send it to Board of Elections. We'll get some feedback from them, and then we can maybe nail this down.
Yeah.
We've been at this for an hour. We said that we were going to do 2 hours, right? Is everybody okay with that? So I would suggest that we should take a look at the second section.
Again, Mr. Chairman, I would take out the, I'm starting at the end, but the shall not be a candidate in the election at which the appointee's successor is chosen.
Okay.
Right,
Right.
right.
Okay. Should we be looking, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask a question before we go, just based on all this conversation with the county executive position, then it looks like we've resorted back to the original language. I guess I want to ask why, and I understand when I'm glad there's suggestions to get people thinking and talking, but I think maybe we should look at the current language and say, what's wrong with the current language? Has there been a problem with any seats being vacated or anything, or before we go into why we should change, and then we resort back to what's already written, because, as you said, there's been discussion before us. So, because it's unless there's been a problem with it, do you know of any problems, Michael, or issues? Or?
Sure. I mean, I know Councilman Miller raised a couple problems, and I mean, I don't want to speak for him. I'm sure we can. He'd be willing to reiterate. I think so currently how it works is, if there's a vacancy on council, and we've had, I think, 3 vacancies on county council, so it does happen on occasion. Just in the last 7 years, we've had 3. And how it currently works is an interim's appointed within 30 days, usually by the party. In every instance, the party has appointed somebody. And then the seat is filled at the next countywide general election, and how that's been interpreted is November elections in even-numbered years, because those are the years in which countywide offices are elected. So you could have we haven't had this exact situation, but you could have a situation where someone, there's a vacancy occurs shortly after a countywide election, where you would have an interim serving for close to 2 years before standing again for election. And I think one of the concerns was one that may be longer than some people would prefer to have an interim serve in that position. And secondly, and this was something that was addressed at the last Charter Review Commission, was it currently says if the vacancy occurs within the first 2 years of the term, then you have that, then it's at the next county general election. And if it's in the second 2 years, they serve out the remainder of the term.
Right.
The problem with that is if a vacancy occurs in October or November of the second year, then normally what you would assume is that position would be filled at the next general election, but that actually, it's too late in the election calendar. You can't fill that position. So the interim actually only would serve. So for instance, this year, we had Councilman Hairston resign on January 1st because he was elected to Cleveland City Council. The precinct committee members of his district appointed Michael Hauser to be his interim. Michael is now running for election to fill out the remainder of Councilman Hairston's term in this November's election. Well, he's running for the primary first, but then the November election. But if you had a situation where, say, Councilman Hairston had resigned in September of this year, it would have been past the primary, it would have been past any filing deadlines to get anybody's name on the November ballot. Technically, how the charter currently reads is that Councilman Hairston, as an interim, would only serve until the November election, and then you'd have a new vacancy, because the interim is only legally entitled to serve until the election. So one of the proposals last time around was changing it so that if the vacancy occurs, I think it was 120 days before the filing deadline for the primary, then there would be an election, and if not, then the interim could serve the remainder of the term. But in that instance, you would have a situation where somebody could serve almost 3 years in an interim capacity. So that was partially why council didn't put that one on the ballot. So those are just some of the variables. I don't know if those rise to the level of, fundamentally changing how vacancies work, but those were some of the issues discussed last time around.
Well, I think hearing those examples, then it kind of makes sense why you want, then, with the new proposal. That, because I could see with this, something going potentially 3 years, and again, that brings up your point that it's not even an elected person, it's someone that got appointed and is pretty much almost filling out an entire term. So, okay.
But I still think there's an open question as to if and when a special election is held. Obviously, you don't have the same operational urgency that you do with the county executive, so filling the seat immediately is less of a concern.
But you still are in a position where there just isn't going to be an election of that sort for a while.
Right.
So that's a long time for somebody to be serving on the strength of an appointment.
So the county seats, they're not staggered 2 and 2?
They are.
They are. So how can someone go 3 years? Can't they be made to run in that election even if it wasn't for that district?
So it's a 4-year term for
Right.
each council member. They're staggered. So they can be made to run. Well, one thing, so how the charter currently reads is it refers to countywide general elections. And because that's only elections in even numbered years, it's basically if it's before a certain date, in this instance, before, the end of the second year, then the interim serves until the end of that second year, whether or not somebody's elected. But if the vacancy occurs after that second year, then they serve for the remainder of the term. So you could theoretically, and I don't know if we want to use the same time frame as the county executive, but you could require a special election be held in, within a year or something after the vacancy occurs. Then you're certainly, you have the opportunities to go on primary elections. You have the opportunities to go on non-countywide general elections, like odd-numbered November years. There are a lot of possibilities there, but I'm not sure. And does that answer your question?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
No. No.
It's complicated.
Complicated. I'm confused.
Yeah, I don't know. Is that the question?
So can I just ask a question, since we have the example of Anthony Hairston and the process going through? It seems like the process is working all right. So my question on this one is, why do we want to change that process?
I think the process has been working on all right so far, principally, and this isn't to say that there's something necessarily wrong with the process, but it's run smoothly. It's had the advantage of well-timed vacancies. So,
Okay.
Councilman Hairston's vacancy was sufficiently, like, it was right before the filing deadline for the primary and for an even-numbered year general election. So the timing worked out well in that, you know, an interim was appointed, and then the interim immediately filed to run in the primary, and you can go through that whole process. But if Anthony, for whatever reason, had resigned, like I said, in September of this year, then whoever would be appointed to replace him would basically serve either, depending on what we do, and we don't change, you know, fundamentally how things work, would either serve through the end of this year, at which point another interim appointment would be made to fill out the remainder of Anthony's initial term, or you'd have somebody appointed to fill out the remainder of Anthony's initial term, which would be basically 2 years and 3 months. So that the timing, depending on the timing, it can be better or worse.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
I guess it's your 3 months worth, is it worth changing it?
For
You know,
3
like
months,
you're saying,
right.
right?
so it sounds as though we're kind of reaching consensus that maybe this is okay as it is. Vic?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are valid criticisms of the current, you know, the way the charter's currently drafted. It's just, it's hard to find a solution that,
It's more elegant.
yeah,
That
I
wouldn't cause the same
right.
concerns about the new wording.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think you got to balance, if you're going to consider doing a special election for a council seat, the cost of doing that against the value of having someone who was actually elected to the position versus somebody who serves in an appointed capacity.
Okay. Moving right along. Next one.
I think that's it.
I think that is it. Yep.
If we don't change
if we
the
don't change
council.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Since these are Councilman Miller's proposed amendments, I mean, would it be worth it to give him the opportunity to address it as opposed to just closing the door?
Oh, sure. I'm not.
And public input.
Yeah, I'm not going to deny him that opportunity.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just so that I'm clear. We proposing to keep it all as is, or just that 3.07? I'm just wondering, I think there were some components that perhaps we could change, such as they could be a candidate if they're appointed in the interim, the losing of the seat. I just want to make sure I'm clear. Are we still considering those things, that they're seated, they don't lose, if the county president is appointed, that they don't lose their seat? Are we still considering that?
Yeah, I thought that was something that we.
Okay, I just want to
said we
make
were
sure
gonna
of
do.
that. Okay.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say is this section that was talking about setting the date of special election, other details regarding special election, et cetera, that's all scotched.
Mr. Chair, I know the commission and at least several members had concerns about leaving things up to council when it comes to setting dates of special elections and some of the procedures, and I even the county executive, I think, supported putting it all in the charter. I think there are going to be some situations where if there are changes in state law or, weird timings that we don't anticipate, it might make sense to have some provision in there that gives council the opportunity to make some changes if they need to. But still, as long as we're comfortable that the general boundaries of where, when the election has to be held and the process that needs to be followed are still in the charter, it might make sense to still give council some latitude to establish some procedures around it. I don't know what other people think, but.
Okay.
Plus also, I still think there probably still should be something in here about a permanent versus a temporary vacancy. I think something should be
Yeah, we need to add some
stated
language
about that. So
along that.
at the very least, and then I still, as Dennis recommended, I'd like to hear what Councilman Miller has to say, because that's when I went back to the question of what are the issues? Are there specifics of why would we be changing this? And it'd be good to hear from him.
Sure. Mr. Miller?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for asking. I actually anticipated this might happen and came somewhat prepared for it, although I wasn't able to anticipate all of the things that were discussed today. But let me put forward what I consider to be the fundamental principles. The first is that having the council president take over upends the county council as well as the administration, and the direction you're going in could leave a council seat vacant for 6 months or longer. So I have concerns about that. The second thing is that I think it's important that the people get to vote on filling vacancies, and that there be special elections relatively quickly. And if we're going to accept that principle, I think that we're going to have to accept the notion that sometimes the special election is going to take place on a date where there isn't any other election. You can't make it always match without there being some very long wait times. Take, for example, if a vacancy occurs a little bit too late. Let's say that that a vacancy occurs on December 31st of 2019. Well, the filing deadline for the 2020 election has already passed. That filing deadline occurs in the first week of December because the primary election is in March. And so that means that that you're too late even for the November election, and it's going to go a very long time if you're going to require it to coincide. And so you're going to have to wait a long time. I came up with a revised version that I'm going to pass around, and the revised version isn't going to answer all the questions, but I guarantee you that you're going to like it considerably better than the original proposal, because for number one, it changes the time given for appointment from 14 to 30 days, which all of you are talking about, and it allows the election to be within 180 days instead of 90 days. And it also says that it takes out the language where a person can't run if they're the interim. I still believe in that, but I think I'm the only one, so I'm willing to let it go. And it also takes out the language where the council gets to fiddle with certain things. The only place where I keep the council's role is about dealing with the temporary vacancies, because I think it's too complex to put it in the charter, and I think you're better to let the council provide for that hopefully rare instance. But anyway, that's basically what I came up with, and it responds to most of the things that were brought up at the last meeting, and yet it preserves the core principles that you're not going to create a mess at the county council at the same time, and that the people are going to have the opportunity to vote within a relatively short time, and also that it's going to make it less likely that outgoing people are going to have a significant role in choosing their own successors, because we don't know what circumstances people are going to go out under. It might not be the circumstances where you want them choosing their own successor. So those are my comments, and I have these, and you can take these and chew on them between now and the next meeting. It might give you a little closer starting place to work from. It's also simpler. It fits on one page, unlike the other one that took 2 pages. So it's a little simpler.
It helps for those of us who have ADHD.
So if anyone has any questions, I'll try to answer them, and if not, I'll say thank you.
I do. What is your opinion about our discussion about the partisan, if a special election was within 180 days, partisan races versus none?
You know, when you go to the ballot, even in the primary, the upcoming primary is a good example. The primary coming up on May the 8th is a partisan primary. But at the same time, everybody gets to vote on issue 1 and issue 9. Well, this could just be an issue just like that. And what I'm suggesting, since I took out the language about the council can fiddle with the exact process, it simply says that there will be a single election where anybody can run, and my assumption is that the candidate's political affiliation would not be listed on the ballot, because we don't do that any place else except in primaries, you know, in partisan elections, and this is a different process. So I'm just assuming it would be a single primary. I think that has the advantage of it costs less money, it can be done more quickly, and particularly if we want replacements to be done relatively quickly, so there's going to be some where you're going to have a special election that doesn't match the date, and so you're going to have to pay for it. And if you're going to have that, you only want to have one of them. So that's what I think. It's an open election with no partisan labels on the ballot.
Let me ask you this, because you'd be in a better position to have a feel for this than we would. Do you think that a significant number of your colleagues on the council would hold similar views?
I just can't tell you. I know that when we had the discussion the last time, part of the reason why the one about the county council vacancies didn't make the ballot was because some people thought we should fill the vacancies with special elections, you know. But whether people are willing to take the leap and say that we should have a special election within 180 days, whether or not you can sync it up with an election date and pay the cost if you have to, I think it's worth it because of the accountability and the legitimacy that it gives to the process. But whether we can get 8 is a high hurdle. Whenever you have something that has this many permutations as to how it can be done, there's going to have to be some people that are going to say, this isn't my first choice, but I'm still willing to vote for it because because as a whole, it's a significant and meaningful improvement. That's the hurdle.
Okay.
I don't think anything about succession can get on the ballot without the recommendation of a charter review commission. It just needs that credibility, because otherwise there's too many permutations, and whatever any one council member comes up with, there's going to be 10 other versions.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Okay.
I just have one other clarification. I thought in our general election, isn't there a party designation for county offices after their name?
Yes, because
Okay.
they
Yeah, I
have
thought it was. So it is.
primaries.
It's not just the primary. It is in the general too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Only the judicial officers are
Don't
denuded.
have.
Okay. Okay. When's our next? Are we scheduled for the 4th?
Yes.
In 2 days?
For Wednesday, the 4th, and that's when campaign finance, Mr. Tarter will be presenting on campaign finance.
Okay. We're going to have to take this up again, you know. But we'll hear from him on the 4th.
Correct.
And then we'll schedule another date to get back to this thereafter. Okay. All right.
Could I just ask a procedural question? So we've asked the Board of Elections representative to help us.
Right.
Could that be done by not Wednesday, but our
In short order?
meeting,
Yeah.
or get the information before our next monthly meeting?
Okay. So at the next, on the meeting on Wednesday, we will set a date, and then depending on the date that we set, we'll give them enough time so that they can have an opportunity to take a deep dive into what we've talked about.
Okay.
And then we can go from there. Maybe hopefully we can have open, candid, and meaningful discussion thereafter. Okay,
Thank you.
okay. All righty. We're at public input.
Yes, Lou.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I didn't attend the meeting last time, but I did watch the video at least thrice to study this thing. I know, well, I'm definitely not a professional in any of these, but something very important, you guys already figured it out. First, probably we do have to separate the temporary and the permanent. However, when I look at the organizational chart, I found out there are actually lots of people in the current systems, they will have the daily operation job duty as just the same as the county executive. The only difference is they are not elected. However, we also know county council members, doesn't matter president or not, actually, I think their positions are part-time. That means they probably currently holding all other professions, and they also want to serve the community at the same time. So for them to step in to be a county executive, which is a full-time job, I don't really think that this will work very well. Plus, the county council members, their perspective is based on what voter, their voters, the people in their district, what they want to see, what they think it should be improved. So it's not completely as an administrative type of job. So I still think if it's temporary, it's still better for the county council member appointed somebody on the same line as the director of law, but it doesn't have to be this position, who actually would deal with county administrative work daily to do the job. That probably will continue the things better till the special election happens. And also, the good idea, of course, for 14 days frame is really, even when I watched the video, I thought that was too short. It's as short as I am. So I thought if we really prepare to 90 or 180 days, that's reasonable. And the other thing, same thing. I always say that in some of the meetings. People cannot schedule to get sick. People cannot get scheduled to get killed. So in this case, we cannot really expect any kind of a situation will actually fall down to our schedule calendar for all elections. So I think today we do come up with new ideas here, which probably will compensate better. I just hope that you guys keep on having open minds. Separating the temporary and the permanent one is a very important issue because we don't want to fall into that situation like Mr. King described. All of a sudden, this person find out, I have to sit here for 3 years, but actually my real passion or my real expertise is on the other side of the government instead of doing the administrative work. I mean, that wouldn't really help everybody that well. And last Tuesday, we have discovered the new cracks. Actually, it's not new. It has been on for decades. So if we keep having things who don't really fit that position very well and to do the job, and we will have all those disasters happen again and again. Think about that 4-year-old died, DCFS. Now, you think those people should be professional, they should do full-time job on that. Even they make all kinds of mistakes. And you want somebody who's not doing this type of work to come to do this type of work. I don't think that will work well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Motion to adjourn? Properly moved and seconded. We stand adjourned until Wednesday at 4:30. 4 p.m. 4 p.m. I keep getting that wrong. 4 p.m. That's why I asked.